They kept taking the parking space in front of my house. And for a while, I honestly thought maybe I was just being one of those grumpy homeowners people joke about online. But then one ordinary Tuesday morning, standing there with a trash bin wedged against a half-open gate, while my coffee went cold in my hand, I realized this had stopped being about parking a long time ago. Funny thing is, I never wanted to own that space. I just wanted to be able to use my own front gate without turning it into a daily obstacle course. My name's Ethan Mercer, and I live on a quiet brick row house block in Riverton, the kind of neighborhood where everyone weighs if they've lived there long enough and pretends not to notice if they haven't. It's close enough to downtown that people want to park here, but just far enough away that residents still think of it as home instead of another commercial district. When I bought the place 8 years ago, the realtor laughed and said, "The house is nice. Surviving the street parking is the real challenge." At the time, I thought she was exaggerating. Turns out she wasn't. Most evenings felt like a scavenger hunt. Sometimes I'd circle the block 3 or 4 times before finding an open space. I never complained because everyone dealt with it, and honestly, that's city life. You win some days, you lose others. What changed wasn't the parking itself. It was the routine. One Monday morning, I noticed a gray Honda sedan sitting directly in front of my gate. Nothing unusual. Visitors came and went all the time, so I parked half a block away, grabbed my groceries, and forgot about it. Tuesday morning, same car. Wednesday, still there. By Friday, I wasn't watching the car anymore. I was watching the driver. Every weekday around 7:15, the guy would leave wearing business casual clothes, coffee cup in one hand, backpack over one shoulder, and every evening around 6 he'd return like clockwork. Weekends? The car barely moved. That's when I started putting pieces together. About 6 weeks earlier, an old furniture showroom on the corner had been converted into this sleek co-working hub called Foundry Commons. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows, exposed brick walls, expensive bicycles chained outside, people carrying laptops that probably cost more than my first car. It brought a lot of energy to the neighborhood, and honestly, I liked seeing the empty building alive again. The problem wasn't the business. It was the math. Their parking garage charged by the day, and our street didn't. Suddenly, dozens of commuters figured out they could save money by parking in front of people's homes and walking 2 minutes to work. Legally, they weren't doing anything wrong. That's the part a lot of people miss whenever they hear this story. I knew the curb didn't belong to me. Public street means public parking. End of discussion. If someone parked there fairly, good for them. But after a while, something else started happening. People weren't just using the space. They were squeezing into every inch they could find. My front gate swings outward toward the sidewalk before opening inward to my small courtyard. And if someone parked even a little too close, the gate couldn't open completely. It wasn't impossible, just awkward enough to become part of my everyday life. One morning, I had to turn my recycling bins sideways and drag them through a gap barely wider than my shoulders. Another afternoon, a delivery driver carrying a boxed bookshelf laughed and asked, "You expecting me to throw this over the fence?" We ended up passing the package through the narrow opening one corner at a time, like we were solving a puzzle. Even my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Dalton, joked that my gate looked like it had developed arthritis. We laughed, because sometimes that's easier than admitting something is wearing you down. The moment that really stuck with me came on a rainy Thursday evening. I'd ordered groceries after working late, and the delivery driver stood outside balancing paper bags while I wrestled with the gate. Apples rolled across the sidewalk, a carton of eggs nearly hit the pavement, and the poor guy finally smiled and said, "Buddy, this gate and that car are having a serious disagreement." I laughed with him, but inside I felt something shift. Not anger, frustration. Quiet frustration. The kind that builds because nobody else notices it. A few days later, I finally caught the gray Honda's owner as he was locking his door. He looked about my age, maybe mid-30s, friendly enough. "Hey," I called. "Mind if I ask a favor?" He turned around. "Sure." I pointed toward the gate. "Would you mind leaving just a little more room when you park? The gate needs a wider swing than it looks like." He glanced at the curb, shrugged, then said, "I mean, parking's first come, first served, right?" There wasn't any sarcasm in his voice, just confidence. From his perspective, he was absolutely right. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, technically it is." He smiled politely, wished me a good evening, and walked away. I stood there for another minute looking at the gate, then at the sidewalk, realizing something important. I wasn't going to solve this by convincing one driver at a time. If I wanted a real answer, it wasn't going to come from an argument. It was going to come from understanding the rules better than I did the day before. That night, I made myself a sandwich, opened my laptop, and started reading city parking regulations with absolutely no expectations. If you told me a year earlier that I'd spend 2 hours voluntarily reading municipal transportation guidelines, I would have laughed in your face. But frustration has a funny way of turning boring paperwork into surprisingly interesting bedtime reading. I wasn't looking for some secret loophole or magical law that would suddenly hand me a private parking space. Honestly, I figured I'd confirm there was nothing I could do, close the laptop, and move on with life. Instead, I stumbled across something I had never even heard of before. Buried several pages into the city's residential access policies was a section describing curb access protection markings. They weren't reserved parking spots. They weren't special privileges for homeowners. They simply allowed residents to request a clearly marked no parking section beside gates or driveways whenever parked vehicles repeatedly interfered with safe access. Reading those words, I leaned back in my chair and actually smiled. Well, that's different, I muttered to myself. The city wasn't offering ownership. They were protecting access, and those two things were completely different. The application turned out to be surprisingly simple. I filled out my address, attached a few photographs of the gate, sketched the direction it opened, measured how much clearance it needed, paid a modest processing fee, and clicked submit. That was it. No dramatic hearing. No lawyer. No angry letters. No speeches about property rights. Just paperwork. After sending it in, I honestly forgot about it. Life has a way of pushing small problems into the background when work gets busy. I run a small graphic design business from home, and a couple of large projects landed on my desk that month. Days blurred together. The gray Honda kept appearing every weekday. Other cars squeezed into the same space whenever it wasn't there, and I simply kept working around them. Every once in a while I'd wonder if the city had even looked at my request, but I never bothered calling. If it happened, great. If it didn't, I'd survive. About 4 weeks later, I woke up earlier than usual because of the sound of diesel engines outside my bedroom window. At first, I assumed another utility crew was replacing pipes somewhere nearby. Then I heard the steady rhythm of metal barricades being unfolded and someone calling instructions across the street. Curious, I stepped onto my front porch with a mug of coffee still warming my hands. 2 city trucks were parked near my gate. Bright orange cones stretched along the curb. 3 workers wearing reflective vests were measuring distances with tape, reels, while another carefully marked the pavement with white chalk. One of them looked up and smiled. "Morning. You Ethan?" I nodded. "Yeah." He checked a clipboard. "We're here for the access marking request." For a second, I honestly forgot what he meant. Then it clicked. "Oh, wow. That was faster than I expected." He laughed. "Trust me, you wouldn't say that if you worked in city scheduling." I couldn't help laughing too. There wasn't any excitement from the crew. To them, it was another routine job. To me, it felt strangely satisfying. They measured the gate swing, confirmed the dimensions matched the application, then masked off a short section beside the entrance before applying bright curb markings and installing a small official sign that simply indicated the access zone had to remain clear. Looking at it afterward, I almost laughed again because it was so much smaller than people would probably imagine. They hadn't removed the entire parking space. They hadn't given me a private curb. They'd simply protected the few feet necessary for the gate to operate exactly as it was designed. That's all I'd ever wanted. The change was immediate. That very evening, several commuters approached the curb, slowed down when they noticed the fresh markings, then continued looking for another space. The next morning, I rolled both trash bins straight through the fully open gate without twisting, lifting, or turning them sideways. It felt ridiculous how satisfying such an ordinary task suddenly became. A couple of days later, another delivery driver arrived, carrying 2 heavy boxes. He opened the gate completely, wheeled the cart inside, handed me the packages, and said, "Nice setup." I almost told him how much effort had gone into making something look so effortless, but instead I just smiled. Sometimes success is invisible, and maybe that's exactly how it's supposed to be. About a week after the markings appeared, I was watering flowers in the small planter beside my porch when I noticed someone walking up the path. Mid-30s, navy polo shirt, office ID badge still hanging from his belt. He smiled before speaking. "Hi. Sorry to bother you. My name's Ryan. I work over at Foundry Commons." I set the watering can down. Sure. What can I do for you? He gestured toward the curb. Are you the homeowner who requested the new access zone? I had a pretty good idea where this conversation might go. Yeah. He took a slow breath. Some people at the office have been talking about it. Parking's become harder. There wasn't any accusation in his voice, but there was enough hesitation to suggest he'd probably been volunteered for a conversation nobody else wanted to have. I nodded. I can understand that. He looked almost surprised that I hadn't become defensive. So, can I ask why? I walked over to the gate, pushed it open until it reached its full swing, then pointed toward the fresh curb marking. Honestly, this is why. He watched quietly as I demonstrated how the gate would hit any vehicle parked too close. For months we'd been squeezing trash bins through here, delivery drivers couldn't get carts inside, and every single day something turned into a minor hassle. Ryan stared at the gate for several seconds before saying, I didn't realize it was that tight. Most people didn't, I answered. I wasn't trying to get anyone kicked off the street. I just wanted enough room for the gate to work. He rubbed the back of his neck and smiled awkwardly. I guess from the office everyone's saying somebody claimed the parking spot. I chuckled. Believe me, if I could legally claim street parking in this city, I'd probably be the richest guy on the block. That made him laugh. The tension disappeared almost instantly. Fair point. He looked back toward the co-working building before asking one last question. So this wasn't about keeping us out. I shook my head. Not at all. If someone parks legally beyond the access zone, I don't care who they are. Residents, office workers, visitors, everybody has the same right to the street. I just needed the gate to open. Ryan stood there quietly for another moment before extending his hand. You know, that actually sounds pretty reasonable. We shook hands, and he headed back toward the office. As he walked away, I couldn't help thinking how differently that conversation might have gone if either of us had shown up looking for a fight instead of an explanation. Sometimes people aren't stubborn because they're bad people. They're stubborn because they're missing part of the story. I figured that would probably be the end of it, but I had no idea the conversation we just had would end up changing far more than the few feet of curb outside my house. The following Monday, something felt different before I even walked outside. Normally by 8 in the morning, our block looked like a game of automotive Tetris. Every legal space filled by commuters rushing toward Foundry Commons with coffee cups and laptops. But that morning there were open spots scattered up and down the street. At first I figured people were working remotely, or maybe the weather had scared a few drivers away. Then Tuesday looked the same. So did Wednesday. By the end of the week, I realized this wasn't luck. It was a new routine. A few evenings later, I ran into Mrs. Dalton while she was trimming flowers along her front steps. She smiled and said, Have you noticed how quiet the street feels again? I laughed. I was just thinking the same thing. She leaned closer like she was sharing neighborhood gossip. My niece works downtown. Apparently that office signed some kind of deal with the parking garage 2 blocks over. Employees get discounted monthly parking now. I stood there for a second, almost disappointed by how ordinary the explanation sounded. No city council showdown. No angry petitions. No lawsuits. No dramatic confrontation where somebody stormed away, slamming a car door. Just a practical solution. Later that afternoon, I happened to see Ryan again outside the coffee shop on the corner. He recognized me first and walked over with a grin. Thought you'd want to know, he said. Management finally worked something out with the garage. Turns out enough employees were complaining about hunting for street parking every morning that they realized paying part of the monthly fee was cheaper than losing time. I smiled. Sounds like everybody wins. He nodded. Honestly, yeah. Most people don't even mind paying now that they know there's always a spot waiting. Before we went our separate ways, he paused and laughed. You know, when everyone first heard about your curb marking, they thought you were trying to chase us out of the neighborhood. I raised an eyebrow. And now? He shrugged. Now most people figure you were just protecting your gate. We both laughed because it really was that simple all along. A couple of weeks after that, I noticed something else. The gray Honda was back one afternoon, but instead of squeezing into the old space, it parked farther down the block where it fit comfortably without blocking anyone. As I carried groceries toward the house, the driver recognized me and gave a small wave. Gate still working okay, he called. I smiled back. Better than ever. He laughed. Guess you were right. It wasn't an apology, at least not in the traditional sense, but it didn't need to be. Sometimes people don't have to say the words for you to know they've reconsidered something. Looking back now, I think the biggest lesson had nothing to do with parking. It was about assumptions. I assumed people understood the inconvenience they were causing. They assumed I wanted special treatment. Neither side was completely right, and neither side was completely wrong. We were simply looking at the same curb from two different perspectives. I also learned that knowing the rules isn't about finding ways to beat people. It's about finding the solution those rules were written to provide in the first place. I could have spent months arguing with strangers every evening after work. I could have left passive-aggressive notes under windshield wipers or started neighborhood arguments online. Maybe I would have won a few debates. Maybe I would have made a few enemies. Instead, I filled out one application, waited patiently, and let the process do exactly what it was designed to do. Every time I open my gate now, it swings all the way without touching a single bumper, and every single time I catch myself appreciating something I never noticed before. How peaceful it feels when an everyday problem simply disappears. The funny part is people still tell this story like I somehow claimed the parking space in front of my house. I always laugh and tell them the truth. I never owned that curb, not for 1 second. What I earned was something much more reasonable: the ability to use my own front gate without unnecessary obstacles. Sometimes that's all fairness really looks like. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my shoes, would you have handled it the same way? Or would you have confronted the commuters long before I ever did? And if you worked at that co-working office, would you have felt the city treated everyone fairly? Or would you have seen those new curb markings as an inconvenience? Let me know down in the comments because I genuinely love to hear both sides of the argument. If you enjoyed this story and believe everyday conflicts don't always need dramatic endings to be satisfying, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who's ever dealt with impossible parking or difficult neighbors. You never know. The smartest way to win a conflict might simply be learning the rules well enough that nobody has to lose.